we're back this week at EDUCA K-16 podcast, where we are having a call to action with Dr. Abdin Novoa Rios. Dr. Abdin Novoa Rios was talking to us last week about the history of Latinos in education and how history is so important. We will continue to dive deep into that theme today. But first, I want to ask Dr. Abdin Novoa Rios, welcome, Dr. Abdin Novoa Rios.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to ask you to please give us context of the growth rate between the different ethnic groups in our public school, public education in the United States.
Thank you for bringing me back to that, because this is very, very important. If we look at the public school sector today, the Latino presence is very, very large. In fact, it's right around 30% currently today, that more than 1 in 4, almost 1 out of 3 students in public schools today is Latino. Now, talking about the growth rate, I had mentioned that it's a hyperbolic curve in terms of Latino growth. The other group that is growing very, very fast, although it's a much lesser percentage of the population, is the Asian Pacific Islander population. Now, different from the Latino population, the majority of the Asian population is based on immigration. Almost 3/4 of the entire Asian population is based on immigration, recent immigration. So their growth pattern is very, very large, but it's an immigration pattern, which does not last for long periods of time. The Latino population is no longer based on immigration. The Latino population is now based on natural reproduction rates. That is, if you take away immigration, the current patterns will not change whatsoever. Now, relative to these two groups, which are the fastest growing groups in the US, the African-American population has plateaued at about 13–14% growth rate. And this has been the case for 150 years. In fact, since the Second World War, it was 14, it inched to 15%, then came down to 14%, now about 13.5%, but it has plateaued over a century. So that growth rate is not going to increase, although relative to the white population, it is increasing. Why? The white population, as I had mentioned, has an annual growth rate that is negative. That is, it's losing population by about 5 to 7% per year. So that's the only population that is losing relative to all other groups. Now, the Native American population, I must say, has some significant challenges. But here, the population is very, very small, barely 1% of the entire public school population. So we don't talk about that population very much in the larger context of what's happening to the Latino and African-American population. So in a nutshell, I hope that gives you some relative differences, some relative measures by which we can now look at these population groups. Put all together, the people of color, these minority groups, as they have been called, will compose the bulk of the public school sector here on. This is not going to reverse in the future. There will be more people of color, students of color, throughout the rest of this century. This century is basically the growth of people of color in this country. And there are lots of reasons why this is going to continue. One of them is because the workforce population in this country has been decreasing. And the only way to continue that workforce population is through immigration and natural reproduction rates. And now we know these numbers and we can project the future. So if we want to see the future of the country, all we have to do is look at the bottom of that population pyramid, that is students or children who are 5 years and below. And that percentage is what will show up even in greater numbers in the near future. And we know what those percentages are so we can properly project. I hope that's helpful.
This is very helpful. And I have to say that, you know, EDUCA K-16 podcast, we're here in a call to action, raising awareness, cultivating curiosity for our education stakeholders, policy changers. You know, we need to understand our history. We need to know past events, right? They're so important for us, not just for Latinos, but for the people of color, for all ethnic groups, for all families in public education, for all Americans. So let's go into a little bit of why are past events so important for Latinx, for Hispanics, as well as Americans to understand, for all stakeholders in education to understand. Let's dive into that a little bit more.
Okay, and thank you for that. I don't mean to be repeating what I said the last podcast, but in a nutshell, for the understanding of social events, history is a must. In fact, I would say history is critical. We must learn from history so that progress is not repetitive and cyclical. That is, it is important to learn the lessons of history so that we can go beyond them and not repeat the past. And let me say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, can you provide some examples?
That without, in a nutshell, without history, we have no past. And without a past, we have no future. Right. And so it's critically important for us to understand where we are going as we understand where we have been and how we have been evolving, or maybe in some aspects, when we talk about social issues, regressing.
Right. And the beauty of this is that you always bring it to us to right now, right? Like, so you're looking at the past so that we can move towards the future and create a better present, right? So it's an alignment that has to happen in education, an equity, right? So diversity is beautiful. It's the tapestry of our nation. So this is a call to action. So let's move forward with your example.
And let me say that the past and the future are very much interrelated. And we don't want the future to be like our past. We want the future to be better than our past. And that's what we call evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that. So honing in the history of Latinos in education, can you provide some examples throughout, you know, maybe with some policies or maybe with bilingual education? Can you go into some examples for us from the past?
Well, the history of Latinos in education greatly foretells what yet needs to occur for the education of the Hispanic population. For example, the country has reversed its policy in dual language instruction, which was fairly common for a while soon after the Civil War. But you would think, from what you hear, from what everybody says, that it just happened yesterday at the start and since the Bilingual Education Act of 1968. Yet, Even though that's the case, it is still problematic in implementation today. But ironically, let's go back. It was available during the 17th century with the advent of the German schools. And this was brought in by the Pilgrims and the Puritans, as it was also in greater usage during the mid to late 1800s. In many states, for example, German in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Swedish in Minnesota, Spanish in New Mexico, among many others. And so,
and I want our audience to understand what you have just said. And I want you to repeat that, because it is not, you know, my goodness, I've worked in dual language programs. I'm an advocate of bilingual education. And the word bilingual is a very heavy word, right? It brings with it a lot of misconceptions. Exactly. So can you repeat for our audience that the Spanish language is not the only language that has been in existence in bilingual programs in the United States? And can you repeat that for our audience? Because I think it's critical to raise this awareness.
Sure. And in fact, let me go back to just prior to 1776. During that period, there was a vote in Congress as to what the language was going to be in the United States. And the German language just lost by a little bit in terms of the English language. I mean, that's how prominent it was at that time. And the German schools, and they got to be called German schools for a good number of decades in this country. The German schools not only had dual language instruction, they had monolingual German language instruction. So we need to understand that in context as we talk about today. Here's an example where history has repeated itself, but in a very different way, and where we have not learned those lessons in history. So the critical question that comes up is, why has it halted over a century ago when it was working quite well at one particular time? And equally important to that is, what can we learn from these events? So now, as we can well surmise, not everything in our educational past has been positive. Not everything has been negative. In fact, most educational events have been, for the Latino, more on the side of negative than positive. And I go into some detail about that. This is not just rhetoric. I go into the history of that in my first book. And so the understanding of all of this becomes very, very important for us to know that if we're going to go into dual language instruction, we need to do it well with the understanding of what was done well and what basically helped the non-English speakers succeed in school barely a century and a half ago. So the policies that we have been selective, but not always in the right direction, and not always formulated to aid the educational process. Why? Largely because of racism, largely because policymakers were not from the lower classes or the underclass at that time. So a number of areas, a number of what I call remnants or vestiges from the past are here to hound us in the present, and hopefully not so much in the future, because they continue to hamper the progress of education today.
So right now we are in a crucial time, right? So 2021, Latinos growth is incredible. We've just discussed that, the growth rate, but also there's a change in administration. And what is that going to mean, right? So you're talking about policy and how it changes throughout history. And here we are again, a new administration. What is that going to mean? So let's continue to focus on history to fully understand, the past conditions, but also let's keep in mind our call to action and solutions as we move forward with this conversation.
Well, and thank you for saying it that way, because our past brings policies, practices, programs that sometimes interfere with the progress that we need to have to improve education today. And these policies and practices constantly arise at many times to our dismay and concern. This means that archaic practices and policies have not disappeared. They are alive and breeding well today. So here we must note that while the country could have gotten away by not educating 10% of the population of students of color some 100 years ago, primarily the percent of Latinos and Blacks during the late 1800s, early 1900s, which was right around 10 to 12%. It cannot ignore educating that population today, which is now 50%. It now represents nearly half the entire school age population and growing. So the point is here that when comparing the drastic changes in numbers of this magnitude, the significance this conveys is immense. As one of my colleagues is fond of asserting, these are the numbers, these are the people that can no longer be ignored as they were in the past. It means that it may have been minor.
They should have never been ignored, right? I mean, let's
you
put
bet.
that in perspective here, right?
Underscore that, you bet. So that it means that it may have been minor yesteryear because the numbers were small. It is undoubtedly rather major today because the numbers are huge. And so that shift in population is what we call a cultural shift in the nation. It's a change of the face of the nation. And that is something that we need to understand, because what worked well yesterday can no longer work well today.
So there's a lot of unfinished business, like you're talking about. There's a lot of social justice issues that you're bringing up in your conversation of how we have not educated or miseducated or ignored, right, certain groups of students. So let's go deeper into other reasons of delving into the history. And I want to make sure that our audience, listening, not just students, teachers, families, but stakeholders, policymakers, listen carefully, because this is a call to action. This is raising awareness and developing new strategies, new solutions moving forward, evolving, like Dr. Novoa Rios is putting it.
Well, there are many reasons that can be given for every major issue that needs to be resolved for programs which are needed today. That is why I continue to reference such a past as bringing persisting remnants and vestiges from history that somehow don't always go away. But the bottom line, to redress these conditions, there is much unfinished business that remains, as you have said. Here it is most critical to realize that what worked well in the past will no longer work for the present. And I know I've said that already, but it bears repeating. These conditions are important to emphasize. These conditions are important to understand. Why? Because institutions, especially school systems, are resistant to changing old habits and ways of doing things. All institutions are this way, but the schooling institution, the public schools in this country, if we look at that history, has been very, very slow in change. One particular example that comes to mind is the tax base which provides funds for education today. Well, these formulas come from past formulas that were derived from conditions faced during the mid-1800s. And as such, they are totally, greatly irrelevant and inappropriate for the current state of affairs. So this must change. Otherwise, rich schools will continue to become richer and poor schools will decay even further. And we have seen that. We have seen the evidence. We have seen the results of that already. Stated bluntly, formulas of old create major problems for the funding of inner city schools today and the cities in large metro areas. So unquestionably, systems need to adapt and formulas need to be revamped and understanding needs to evolve to a new level. If we do not bring in the minority perspective, the minority context, and I'm using these terms sometimes rather loosely, but if we don't bring in the perspective of persons of color who know this experientially into that picture, into that decision-making process, full-fledged at all levels, we are not looking at the future of America as we should. And that has been a major oversight in our educational system throughout.
Dr. Abdigno-Rios, crucial conversation with you about not just Latinos in education, but the entire public school system. We need to be aware of our history in order to not make those same mistakes that we made before so that we can evolve and not go around, right, in a cyclical pattern. I want to close us out with a former board member of Chicago Public Schools, a professor, an author who wrote and commented on your book, Carlos Azcoitia, who I quote says, "The author articulates an explicit rationale which emphasizes the urgency of his findings with a call to action." And this is exactly what this is for our audience listening, for those stakeholders in education. This is a call to action. Stay tuned next week as we continue to dive deeper with Dr. Abdigno-Rios in the pressing issues in education today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. My pleasure.